Electrocast.
The PC gave us computing power at home, the internet connected us, and mobile let us do it pretty much anywhere. Now generative AI lets us communicate with technology in our own language using our own senses. But figuring it all out when you're living through it is a totally different story. Welcome to Leading the Shift, a new podcast from Microsoft Azure. I'm your host, Susan Ettlinger. In each episode, leaders will share what they're learning to help you navigate all this change with confidence. Please join us. Listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
As a contractor, I don't pay for materials I don't use. So why would I pay for stuff I don't need in my mobile plan? That's why the new MyBiz plan from Verizon Business is so perfect. Now I can choose exactly what I want, and I only pay for what I need.
Right now, with MyBiz Plan, get our best price, as low as $25 a line. Visit verizon.com/business to get started today. Price per month with 5+ lines. Includes autopay and paper-free billing and special intro offer discounts. Taxes, fees, economic adjustment charge, and terms apply. Offers end June 10th, 2025.
Hey, welcome to Brain Arcade. I'm your host, Chris Cross, and today we have a special guest, Martin Montgomery. He and I worked together on Silent Hill Ascension, where we were trying to get aggregated input from people to influence a storyline in real time for different outcomes. So a little bit of an interactive TV show. Martin, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background as a game designer and a little bit of what you do and what you like to do?
Yeah, first of all, I have to say, I don't think anyone's ever pitched that project that way, Chris. That was a really interesting and succinct way to talk about that project. Anyway, so I got my start at Telltale. Prior to that, I was working as a story artist in animation, and I really liked games. I played games for a long time, and I don't know, Telltale was this weird combination of a lot of things that I liked and was doing at the time, between directing and writing and doing story. And as a someone that was young enough to remember when Monkey Island came out, or I guess old enough actually, it was really fun to get to work with a lot of people that had made some of my favorite games growing up, right? So at Telltale, right, like they had sort of, I don't know if the word pioneered is the right word, but they had really thrust a particular way of doing interactive narrative into the public consciousness and really took off with Walking Dead. And so from there, I got to direct on some projects. I was a director on The Wolf Among Us and Tales from the Borderlands. And from there, kind of my career has always kind of revolved around narrative and kind of the intersection of game design and narrative from there. So I did a stint at Riot for a little bit. I did a couple of startups. And then as you and I mentioned, we crossed paths on Silent Hill.
So it's interesting. You're then just some feedback. Like your intuitive game design chops are much stronger than I think you think.
Okay. Thank you. I'll take that, and that made my day. Thank you, Chris.
Yes. Well, there you go. So I guess what I'm saying is like embrace that a little bit, because like I don't think of you as just a pure narrative designer. Like you definitely have a capital GD game designer in your repertoire.
Well, thank you.
So that brings us to Brain Arcade. So in Brain Arcade, the idea is that the way I think about games is, it's the only entertainment where you're having a conversation with the audience. It's set up ahead of time for them to play it, but you literally have to think about what they're thinking about. Right. And so the idea is that my observations over 30 years is kind of apocryphal, but I'm talking to as many people as possible to see if we can solidify this idea that psychology is a big part of designing video games and actually identify some of the things that maybe we can expose to people and discuss and talk about. And it's not just, jump button makes jump man jump.
Right. Yes.
So tell me a little bit about, so you cut your teeth at Telltale, and then we did, like I said, audience experience storytelling at GenVid, but regular, like even linear single player video games have strong narratives. What are you thinking about from a psychology standpoint when you endeavor to create something new, just right from the beginning? Like, tell me a little bit about that process.
Well, let me talk about it first from a story lens. As a storyteller, really what you're dealing with is you're eliciting emotion from your audience, right? Like you want them to feel a certain way. There's that whole thing about this relationship between like a magician and their audience, in that they're effectively lying to their audience, but the audience member like has agreed that that's okay. In kind of a similar way, when you kind of receive story, you're kind of like setting yourself up to kind of have your emotions manipulated, because we tell stories for a number of different reasons, but one of those is it makes us feel things, right? And so as a storyteller, you are thinking, at least from a psychology lens, you're always thinking about, how do I think I want my audience to respond to this? And then from an interactive side, you're trying to predict, well, what do I think they are going to do in response to this?
So that's fun. Like basically there's some illusion making, right? And
sort of, yeah. I guess you could say it that way. Sure.
Not illusion making, but I think there's two examples that come up for this. One, not losing connection to the experience that the other person is having, but also making sure that everything's working right, but backstage, right? It's almost it's a production as far as like making sure that everything links together. And then the other comment is like there's a partnership between audience and the magician, right? And I'll continue to use your analogy where it's like, hey, there are things that you can't see, but I'm telling you a story with my hands or with whatever the trick is. There's an empathy between the performer and the thing. So like, tell me a little bit about like, where do you connect with that empathy? Like, how do you start to identify that? Even just starting out writing a story.
Sure.
What's your thought process there?
Well, at the broadest level, you're thinking about theme, right? Because every story, sure, it has a plot and you have characters and they do things and there's conflict. But at the end of the day, the best stories are connecting with people via a theme, whether that's the theme of good versus evil, or something more existential about what is my place in the world, or if you want to get specific, like take something like Finding Nemo. That movie is it has a story where you have a clownfish that goes and tries to find his son out in the ocean when he's lost, but really like what that story, the theme is actually about learning to let go as a father, right? Like that's actually what that story is. And so when you finish seeing that, sure, you had some laughs and some touching moments, but the theme is what you're left with at the end of that that story. And so anytime you're working with story at the most top down level, you're thinking about theme. Another way someone said it is, what is the truth that you're asking the audience to sort of sit with and think about, a truth about the world,
What's interesting is like I said, my apocryphal sort of experience with this stuff. I've never called it a theme. I've always called it the 3-word story.
Sure.
So it's like the 3-word story of Mario Brothers Who Saved the Princess.
Yeah.
And, in the early days, themes were really simple. Save the world, save the princess, win the race. You know what I mean? Like even multiplayer games have themes that just tend to be outlast and survive to win the game or something like that. And there's like, I think the reason that people walk away from entertainment with those themes is because they can compartmentalize it and encapsulate it into like a quick summation, right? So it's like, nobody actually, like, I think the words come out, but the way they store it is like, hey, tell me what Super Mario Brothers is about.
Yeah.
And they'll say like, oh, you're a plumber saving a princess, right? And so some of the details start to come in and they start talking about stuff.
Yeah.
But like that theme comes out as opposed to sometimes a description of like the world or the levels or different things like that.
Yeah.
When writing themes though, where are you going? I'm not sure how to word this, but it's essentially, what is it? There are seven stories that are, man versus God, man versus man, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And
yeah.
Themes to me sit like one level down on the pyramid from there, because there's a pretty common number of themes. Like, do you find yourself basically revisiting the same themes a lot, or are you?
So there's like, I don't know if this is an actual quote, but I know it has been said that, every story has basically been told. What hasn't been done is the way that you tell it, right? So take any rom-com, right? Of like the guy meets girl story's been done a million times, right? But it's the way that you tell it that makes it feel fresh and new. And in a weird way, people kind of like that. There's kind of a familiarity that we kind of like. And so that's often a place where people will start, is something that feels somewhat familiar, because it's an easy way to kind of help hook your audience in. But once they're there, oftentimes they're looking for something fresh within that. So it's kind of the same process with anything creative. You start broad and then you start drilling down deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, right? As you keep going,
So in thinking about these themes, there's two questions, because it's kind of a segue. How much are you thinking about the audience psychology in that moment when you're doing that? Or like, where is that you're connecting, or is that something that basically has become muscle memory for you,
Mm.
and the audience is kind of like not assumed, that's maybe a little too soft, but
Mhm.
basically they're a static concept for you.
So one thing that's kind of interesting is I think that answer varies based off the shape of what type of game experience you're doing,
Mhm.
right? Because if you're doing something that's like purely story forward, you're using a lot of the same muscles that you would for like a film or television show. You know what I mean? So
Right.
at Telltale, for example, those were basically screenplays. They were like interactive screenplays, and so a lot of the language and things was pretty couched in what you would experience if you were trying to develop a TV or film. But as soon as you get into something that's way more systems driven, you have to play differently because the audience expectation of what they're there to do is different. So let's take like a game like Mega Man, the series Mega Man. From
Uh-huh.
a gameplay standpoint, like the loop is go through a level, kill a boss, get a new power, and you keep doing it again and again and again.
Right.
There's like a power progression theme that's like baked into that loop that also works really well from like the meta narrative of you're this robot that is like able to absorb new powers and grow stronger. And so even though it's a really simple conceit, and sure they've like I guess fleshed out the Mega Man lore, like the simple conceit of marrying that narrative theme of like I want to grow stronger and marrying it
Uh-huh.
with the gameplay loop is where you get to the like real secret sauce. You know what I mean?
Right.
If you're working as a narrative designer.
So here's interesting. Sorry, it is a game design aside. The way that I thought about this traditionally, especially in the '90s,
Mm-hmm.
where basically almost every game followed this, and I would say it's a sub theme,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there's a layer down from Save the Princess.
Mm-hmm.
The next layer down is coming of age, or
Mm-hmm.
basically the hero's journey, but told as a teenager,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so Mario 64, I brought up in an earlier episode where I talked about why it's intentional that Mario has the proportions of a toddler in that game.
Mm. Mhm.
Not just because it kind of matches his previous like small that can grow big.
Yeah,
Notice he doesn't grow big in that game, right? He starts to get hats
totally.
and stuff.
Yeah.
But also, if you run around with Mario, he runs and moves like a toddler.
Mhm.
There's a subconscious connection there to this age where just running was fun.
Yeah.
And so there's some sort of psychological hooks into the theme and the expression of like
Mhm.
Mario's going to come of age a little
Mm.
bit and get new hats and open up new worlds. And, there's this exploration there. It's the
Yeah.
same in Zelda. Like Zelda 64 did this very explicitly with starting out as young
Mhm.
and then like going through time to be more of a like upper adolescent young
Mhm.
adult
Mhm. Yeah.
who's now expressing powers in a different way. And like I think that plays on players from like a subconscious like identification place. It doesn't matter the gender, sex, or anything of the
Right.
main character. You're attaching to something that everybody goes through, which is I knew nothing and now I'm
Yeah.
learning about myself and my powers, right?
There's a fun trick that games will do too, where so let's go back to Mega Man. I'm going to talk about Mega Man X, which is like one of my
Yes.
favorite games of all
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
There's a really cool moment in the very first level, right, where you meet Zero, and Zero is like the super powered like version of you, right? Like you get to
Yeah.
see what you're going to look like by the time you reach like the final levels of the game. And Zero has this like blonde like Saiyan DBZ's Saiyan
Right.
hair. They have his
Right.
sword and like all this cool stuff, and you're looking at that and you're like, wow.
Right.
That's another cool thing that I think they'll do is they'll give you a peek of what you're gonna look like, you know?
Yes, and this plays on something that actually shows up in lots of other areas too. Like, by the way, like go to Target,
Mm-hmm.
look at all the Nerf stuff and all those
Mm-hmm.
the squirt guns.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they're aged 8 and up or something like that,
Mm.
you'll never see a child on the box. They're always teenagers because they're trying to show you something cool.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they're imprinting an image of who you're fantasizing about being. So you're
Yeah.
fantasizing about being someone older, and so it's like an informed shopper thing with
Mm.
Mega Man, where like, oh, this is what you could be.
Right.
It's all going to be worth it. Which you and I have talked about game loops, right,
Mm-hmm.
and how they're nested and they stacked, and
Mm-hmm.
usually somewhere in there, if we work backwards, is like why am I doing this? Save the princess. Like, why
Mhm.
do I care? Or like, why is it interesting? Coming of age. Like, there's a power fantasy that gets built in. And then the
Totally.
next layer down is like, the exhibition of skill. And then a
Mhm.
layer down from that is like, I don't even have to think about which button I have to hit when I play this because I'm showing mastery, right?
Totally,
And so
totally.
like, there's this like stacked thing there, which I guess brings me to like, what do you think about that from a narrative building standpoint? Do we address all of those layers, or is that something that you think stays at the upper layers of like, that internal conversation the player's having?
I think you start at like the highest level of it's almost like you come up with a theory or a hypothesis, right? And then you kind of get it, especially in games. Like obviously iteration is important in any creative endeavor, but I feel like particularly with games there's this like discovery period
Uh,
where you're doing play testing and you're putting it in front of other people, and your theories get tested. You're like, ooh, I think it'd be really fun if we did this type of quest or like whatever, if you're making an RPG, right? Like I've got this idea. I think that people are going to respond to it in a particular way because we talked earlier about like eliciting emotion, right?
right.
And then it completely falls flat. And you're like, wait, what? Why did that not work? Right. And,
Right.
and oftentimes, it's a myriad of different things of why something might not be working. Like it could be, the dialogue isn't good, right? And so I'm not responding to it from a character standpoint, or the art doesn't really make me want to come and talk to this person and interact with them, right? Or I'm confused about what I'm supposed to be doing, so my objectives are muddled, right? So I don't think anyone comes out with a fully fledged form of like, it's going to be this, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a fun part of envisioning what it could be, and then it sort of once you birth it, it becomes this living breathing thing,
Right.
and you're kind of like working with it as it's like, I don't know, it's like you're a parent, you're watching this kid that you had these dreams for, and now they're like, it's becoming this other thing, and that's also exciting.
Yeah, I agree. I think just coming from a slightly different era and like trained a little differently, for me, it was always like, I would express it this way, is I would set the high end target and the lowest of low end targets.
Mm,
And the process is how we make them join.
mm-hmm.
Right. And so like I know what the target is, it's save the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? But like at the lowest end, it's a game about like having a bionic arm that acts like a grappling hook. Right.
Totally.
And so
Yeah.
like I don't know the full path in between necessarily. Well,
Yeah.
actually in the late 90s, you had to predict all of that stuff early on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But the games were also much smaller.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that brings me to an interesting point. So let's talk more about interactive story. Like we've
Mm-hmm.
sort of touched it generally. Before you get like start off on that, what's really interesting about Mega Man is I think one of the early Mega Mans was the first time that progression wasn't necessarily linear,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? You had
Yeah.
options. And
Yeah.
so
Of how you wanted to tackle it.
I'm sure like when it was that simple, or not simple, but when things were a little bit less complex, it was way easier to tell the game story in a
Mm-hmm.
non-linear fashion. But as we get more and more tied to like a linear narrative, it gets
Yeah.
much more difficult. So like start out with Telltale. Tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about like feeling your observation that it's a very linear.
Yeah. So Telltale did something that we call like embedded narrative, right? Which is where the creators have a prescriptive written out story, design story, however you want to
Mhm.
say it, that you're going to experience, right? And so they are going to lead you through. If I put it in like Disney terms, it's like being on Pirates of the Caribbean. You are strapped
Okay.
into the ride vehicle, and they're going to put your eyeballs generally where they want them to be, and
Yep.
we're going to lead you through this because we want the experience to be somewhat similar for everybody, right? So that's embedded narrative, right? So at Telltale, right, like choose your own adventures had been around for forever, I guess, like since like the 70s, I guess was the first time those books got really popular, I think.
Yep.
And I think what Telltale sort of really put on the map though was, and taking advantage of using a digital medium, was that they were really trying to allow you to craft and make impression on characters over the course of a story. And by craft, I mean you got to sort of role play your version of that character. But I think the magic sauce was at the time it was the so and so will remember that, right? Like you make a choice, and it says that character will remember the choice that you did. And it was funny how that one little like UI pop up held all this like emotional weight, because you're like, oh my gosh, like I've really offended this person, and it's gonna come back to bite me later on in the story, right?
Yeah. So actually, let's take a side trip there. Like,
Yeah.
that's interesting, because I think what you're identifying is there was an unintended consequence of putting that UI up. We're not unintended completely, because clearly somebody had to make a decision to put that piece of UI up, right? But the psychological impact, I think, is what you're saying had like a much greater impact or much greater effect than was originally planned, and it actually ends up being a happy accident. So what is it about that system that you think that made it have that much impact?
Well, from the very beginning, like when you started up, say, Walking Dead, it said, your choices matter, right? Like that was like over black, right? Like it tells you how it's going to be. So from the get go, they're promising that the choices that you make in the story are going to have real impact on the narrative. And so I think they were, I don't know if they, because I wasn't in the room to design this feature, but like, I don't know if they were anticipating, oh man, this is going to like really, have ramifications. But I think that they knew what they were trying to do, which was to reinforce and hammer home this idea that your decisions have weight in the narrative, and we are accounting for the agency that you're exhibiting in the story.
So let's actually dig into that a little bit more. Like, and I'm being a little dense here, but like, just to lead the conversation some. But like, why is that important to the players of Telltale games, right? Like, you basically, if I could summate it, the power of that UI is it's informing the audience that their decision has weight, right?
Yep.
And there's a fun thing. It's like somebody handing you a magic wand, right? And like the impact of that is like, oh wow, I have power and agency here.
Yeah.
And do you think that that's part of the formula that makes the Telltale game so beloved? As far as like, for me, it's a little too heavy on narrative generally for my tastes.
Sure.
But I think the audience that loves those, that's right up their alley, right?
Yeah. So I think there's two things to that. Let me talk about the narrative side. First of all, the team delivered a killer all-time narrative.
Yes.
Right? I mean, they nailed it, right? And so you have it from that standpoint, because had they not stuck the landing on the story, it always sours people on the experience when they look back on it. I mean, look at Game of Thrones, right? Like, so I think that's the thing, is they stuck the landing on the story. And I think because it kind of came a little out of nowhere, like it was the very first mainstream thing that Telltale had done, and everybody was like, this is pretty good, right? And then the next episode comes out and they're like, wow, this is pretty good, right? And then you start like kind of rooting for the team. You're like, I really hope this like sticks the landing. And so they did from a story standpoint. So I think that's kind of the first thing that was crucial to the success of that. I think the second part is they were doing something that at least hadn't been done in that way, or hadn't been done in a while, which was, this is Martin's personal theory about, interactive media. The best kind of interactive media is one where when you push, it pushes back in interesting and surprising ways. And I don't necessarily mean that in pure narrative. I mean, like, when you play Link to the Past and you have the magic powder and you go and you sprinkle it on everything in the world and different things happen and it's surprising and interesting, like, that's really cool. Right? Like, that question in the player's mind of like, I wonder what would happen if X, Y, and Z did. And then it does. And then you realize they thought about that. Like, now you're eliciting a smile from your players because they were rewarded for their curiosity. Right. So taking that idea, I think that what they did at the time and sort of pioneering is they were pushing back within narrative storytelling in a way that hadn't really been done that way, or at least it hadn't been done in that particular configuration. Because again, like I said, Choose Your Own Adventure had been around for a while, but the advantage of that medium was, oh man, I can, if I really want to make this guy mad in this conversation, I can do that. And the storytellers have accounted for that within the narrative. Right. And so that whole notion of like, I push on the world and the world pushes back on me, I think is really powerful. And so I think those two things that they did, really well with that. Right.
Mhm.
So bringing it back to that UI was just another indicator of saying, hey, we're listening, we're paying attention. If you push on us, we will push back on you in some interesting and surprising ways.
To bring it back to the magic analogy for a second, it's kind of the equivalent of like, is this your card?
Right.
Right.
Yep.
This is what you chose. This is your card. Like, hold on to this moment, because I'm going to make it all pay off in a little bit. So what's interesting, and the way I say it is that every game, like there's a fantasy that people want to fulfill, whether it's like, modern shooter or Baldur's Gate, like an RPG or something like that. There's a contract that's actually happening between the designers and the audience. And basically that works into the psychology of like fantasy fulfillment.
Right.
Right. And like, I'm selling you, like I said, seeing the Mega Man you could become, right? Is basically you're selling like a future fantasy. And so like this contract is actually built a little bit on trust, because they're saying, I trust you to take me to the right place.
Right.
And like, the way that I see that UI is reaffirmation that the promise of this is an interactive story, you're going to guide it somewhere, is being like I said, is this your card? Right. I am showing it back to you. I'm reinforcing it. It's not just, at the end of the game, play it again. You'll see you can get multiple outcomes. Right.
Yeah, totally.
It's like revealing just enough of the trick to keep you engaged and make you feel empowered.
So good, so good, so good.
New markdowns up to 70% off are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. And that means thousands of can't-miss deals just in time for summer.
The denim section is unreal.
Why do I rack? All the dresses.
I always find something amazing.
Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
All right, let's talk about like diamond shaped.
Yeah.
Or sometimes you could call it like a boa constrictor that swallowed a bunch of ostrich eggs, right? Where it's like there's a linear path in its totality, but there are moments of freedom. And the challenges of not only the structure of that, but from a narrative standpoint, keeping that promise of agency while still feeling like not only that I'm having a difference, but that the outcomes are worthwhile. And not just it's interesting you brought up Pirates of the Caribbean, because like I used to send all my level designers to go ride that because I was like, it's the most perfectly designed game level for a linear video game ever, because you can't see it all in one shot. There's environmental narrative, and there's several threads even before they did the Pirates movie tie-in, right? And sort of restructured it. It was the same in the Haunted Mansion, right? Like as soon as you get in line, the storytelling begins.
Yes.
And it happens outside the ride. All right. The other one though is the old Autopia. Are you old enough to remember Autopia?
Is it the car one?
It's the car one.
Yeah, the car one that drives you.
They're like go-karts. But like it used to be, there were no tracks. It was a go-kart track, but it became kind of dangerous. And so what they did is they gave you, 3 feet of freedom left and right. So like you have control of the gas, but you have a little bit of a leeway. And I think that's my sort of segue into this. Like it's a linear narrative, but we're going to allow you to go off path a little bit.
Yeah.
It's going to be more than Autopia, but I think visually, when I think of this type of thing, that's a little bit of the analogy I go for. So tell me a little bit about that structure and the challenges of that.
So let me start with the hardest challenge with that is, as soon as I give you agency as a player, you're taking control away from me as the storyteller or game designer or whatever your role is on that, right? Which means I run the risk of you potentially putting yourself in a position where you're no longer having a good time with your experience, right? So
wait, hold on.
Yeah.
Well, before you move on, like I actually really like the way you worded that, because it was about their experience and not your frustration with structure.
Sure.
Right? And like I think that's a really important like footnote to call out, is because like the whole point of what we're doing is for players to have a good time.
Totally.
And like the care that you're implying in the structure and the building of the structure is to ensure they're having a good time, not how clever of a story structurist you are.
Well, because here's the thing: if I built the thing, it's not your fault necessarily that you ended up there. It just means I didn't anticipate that was a way that you could go down that. So let's talk about it from like the narrative lens, right? Like story has really specific structural rules that have been honed over millions of years of humans being on Earth telling story. Like even if you don't consider yourself a writer, everyone has this intuitive built into your body sense of understanding how story works, because you've been on the receiving end of a great story, and you might not be able to say why it worked, and that's totally fine, but you can say, wow, I really liked that was a great story, right? So what's tricky is part of the draw of an interactive experience is you having agency. But that immediately starts to put that in conflict with some of these hard and fast rules about what makes for a great story, right? So, if we look at the classic fairy tale structure of, once upon a time and every day until one day and then the end, right? Like that is the structure for that story. So what happens if the player says, well, once upon a time, there was a farmer and he died. Well, now the story's over and you've cut off and maybe that was the choice that you wanted to make, but was the agency that you got to express over that narrative actually worth cutting off the really good stuff that we had for you later on? I don't know. For some people, I think it is, but I would say for a lot of people, that didn't end up being a very satisfying entertainment experience because you've been cut off on that, right?
Right. And well, what's interesting there is there's a whole side conversation here that we can skip over for now, which is essentially the partnership between game player and game designer and the reward structures that we set up. And so generally if this were a more traditionally old school game, it would be well, you died, start again, right? And basically here's the penalty. The penalty is you died.
Totally.
The reward for the next thing is whatever the next cut. Oh, back in the day when cutscenes were super rewarding.
Yes.
Right?
The Final Fantasy CG high budget things were the reward for ending an act on a disc, right?
I went from pixels to this amazing CG was
totally
super rewarding, right?
So tying it back to as a creator or storyteller, you have to account if you're going to give the audience that kind of freedom, you have to account for that. So a great example is Stanley Parable. Yeah. If and for those that don't know, the Stanley Parable is this great game that's all about choice, right? And it follows this really boring office worker named Stanley. If you haven't played it, you should go play it. But one of the great things about that is if you are just so enraptured by this narrator who's narrating everything that you're doing and you never leave your cubicle, the game accounts for that. So it keeps, and in some ways, some of those you never made it out of the first room endings are really entertaining and surprising and fun, right? And so it's huge kudos to the creators because they not only gave you the freedom, but they also made sure that it was a good time and entertaining if you chose to go that way. And that's the danger, is if you're going to give the audience that agency and you're not anticipating what that experience is going to be like and accounting for it, they're going to have a bad time. Yeah. And I'm sorry, it's your fault. It's not their fault, right? Because you made the thing, right?
1,000%. This is not related to narrative, but an interesting example. I was a notorious game breaker, I started in QA, and so it was just built into my DNA, even playing games in the arcade. But one of the things that I spent hours trying to do was to get on top of Mario's castle in Mario 64.
Oh yeah.
Which was extremely difficult to do, but possible. And so
same,
it's one of those things where I felt like I was about to break the pact with the designers. Right.
Yeah.
And the mental, the psychology behind it, if I got up there and Yoshi handed me a star, would have been oh my God, I can't believe you went here as a designer and are actually rewarding me for essentially being a teenager and kind of breaking the rules. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like being rewarded for exploration. But anyway,
real quick, do you know what my sadness about that was? Because I did the same thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is like kid lore where, you know, somebody told me this on the playground or something, but I had heard it was rumored there was an extra level inside of the inside of the stained glass where the princess is. And so in order to get access to it, you had to get onto the roof, talk to Yoshi, and then you could fly into the window, and there was like one final like world. And I was so disappointed when there was nothing else.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's funny. I went there just because I'm that kind of a jerk, and there was no like, you know, potential carrot like waiting for me. So I'd never heard that rumor. That's super interesting. Well, the thing is though is level -1 in Super Mario Brothers, where you had to hit a brick big with the back of your head and like
glitch through the thing,
glitch through the wall and stuff. So like, even though that was a glitch, it was still super rewarding because it was like, I don't know, this feeling of like unlocking a secret or like, you know, the explorative value of it. We kind of went off onto an aside, but like back to player psychology a little bit. I mean, let's talk about, so I have a problem, and we're going to go to the next like sort of layer out, which is a little bit more like the transition between linear with pockets of agency to like the games that I think straddle this line, in the fact that there's kind of two games in one, and that's like open world games, right? Where like there's a linear narrative in Grand Theft Auto, but the things that I do in the world is almost completely divorced of what's happening. Like it's sort of in the same theme sometimes, but like, you know, what I'm doing from an action standpoint is can be, you know, like can cause the, and I'm going to throw out the ludonarrative dissonance word. Which you can do later.
Where's the Pee Wee Herman word of the day?
That's right. Like Cherry's going to come out, and like, you know. But to me, like I got to the end of Grand Theft Auto 4, and I was actually bent because I felt like the distance between the two was so vast that I quit caring about the story. Or like basically it was so like jarring to get to the end where I was like, you know, you have to make assumptions about the character and who you're playing. And then, you know, I got there and I was like, but that's not who I was playing. Right. And so like the contract was not broken, but it was stretched to, you know, its boundary.
Yeah. So, you know, I think we're talking about like the tension between emergent narrative, right? Which is what you're talking about. I go out into the open world and I have my toys to play with, and interesting things happen on that journey. And then what we talked about earlier, the embedded narrative, right? So there's a main storyline that it's like, you know, you do this mission and it progresses the story forward, right? And there's always the potential of there being, as you said, that disconnect or ludonarrative dissonance between, well, this is who I'm sort of role playing as, and then this is who they're wanting. There's like a canon version of this character that's different than my version.
Right.
So I think honestly, I think one of, like, obviously this game did extremely well, but I actually think the latest two Zelda games did this really in a really interesting way, because it's almost like, rather than, I progress the story forward, it leans into the open worldness of it, and you unfold the story in whatever order you want to, which is interesting because it's almost like that mystery of like filling in the blanks kind of keeps drawing you in, even though there is like an explicit embedded narrative that exists in the story. In a weird way, I feel like it plays nicer with those emergent storylines. Do you know what I mean? Because it's like a reward in some ways from the exploration, which is a thing that I want to do anyway in that game. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in my mind, it like actually plays really nicely with that open world structure. You know, it's not like there are set places in, well, this isn't true because there are like items that there are places where you investigate that sort of moves the story forward, but you can do it in any order that you want to, and you can even ignore it. too, right? Like you can go straight to the castle like as soon as you're ready and attempt to fight Ganon, and you can ignore all of the like stuff that was happening before that.
Right. It's interesting because, traditionally that would be breaking the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like as far as like traditional structure goes, it would be like, wait, what are you doing? Like you're not, you shouldn't be going there. Right. But like, I
Like
think it's an interesting.
The strength of that game's narrative is more in the world building and in supporting that open world gameplay, right? Than it is in some explicit embedded narrative. Like they start you off with embedded narrative of like, in the first game, it's, Link's been asleep for like 100 years and now he's finally awoken to, in the time of need kind of thing. It plays nicely, which is the main draw of that game is we're going to give you some really cool toys and your destination is pretty much going to be the same, but our journeys to get there are going to be very different. And we hope that it leads to some really cool stories along the way,
I have to say, I tapped out of Zelda pretty early because I think it was a little too free for me. I love doing stuff, but like, I really do enjoy watching some of the ways that people have used the crafting systems.
Oh, it's amazing.
Which totally changes their. And this is the I think the topic that we sort of wrap back up to and then sort of close out this call, which is their narrative, right? The player's narrative of what's going on their side of the screen is different potentially, or like basically you brought it up as role playing. Like who are you role playing, or how are you role playing that? And that's part of the agency too. And that's not something that you don't necessarily. It might be indirect, right? Like you're giving tools for that, but it's not necessarily like hit the button to choose which narrative. It's like the player is bringing their own conception of who they want to be. And so like when I see people build mecha in like Zelda and like fight bosses like that, it's like their story is so different than the way I probably would have attached to it. Right.
Oh, same thing. I never built like a big giant mecha tank to fight, but I did build that super handy hover bike that like literally lets you fly anywhere. And that in itself was really fun, right? Because you start off in that underground area and it's this kind of scary place where you can't see very well. But as soon as this, you build your way up to that, and now you suddenly feel like it's no longer scary because like I can slap a headlight on it and I can literally go anywhere I want. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of funny. And that in and of itself is like, that's a story, right? Like, it's like being on a desert island where everything's out to kill you. And then in like a year, you're like Tom Hanks in Castaway. You've mastered the wilderness, right?
Right. So it's interesting. And I'll just sort of close out with this because I think where we've ended up is like, there's a really important piece of the narrative. And I think people get misled when they talk about game narrative and just thinking about the writing in that I used to call it water cooler talk or playground talk in that the stories that I always wanted to inspire were the stories that were told away from the game, right? Yeah, nowadays you could call that like social media fodder or like whatever. But essentially it was like, how do you manufacture word of mouth, right? And so to me, that was just as important in like giving players agency enough to craft their own interactions. And like, it's difficult. I'm not going to say that every game needs to have it. Like pin out on Apple iOS does not need to have that progression, but
totally.
When you're building something even that's semi-linear in format, giving people the feeling that they're writing their own experience through the game is super powerful. So we're almost at time, but what I want to do is I'm going to wrap up by first inviting you to come back. And then the topics that I want to cover is a little bit in that space of players outside the screen narrative and maybe a little bit of like, how that leads into the next section, which is like, let's talk about emergent narrative some, because emergent narrative is like super powerful if you get it right, but it's super difficult to design for, right? And like, maybe you and I can try to tackle that as like, let's just talk about emergent narrative.
Yeah.
To me, it's the magic space where the mechanics of the game and the psychology of the fantasy are fully enmeshed, right? And like, there's a golden crossover zone there that I think we can hit.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. I was gonna say that was like an opening for like Martin's gonna close us out, but like sounds good.
Okay.
It's good too.
No. I can. We'll do an edit point there, I guess.
No. I think we leave that in. This is the fun part of the podcast.
So I think next time it would be super fun to talk about emergent narrative a little bit more. Obviously, as these sort of big open world games have gotten popular in recent years, but I think there's a lot of lessons to take from that, even in things like roguelikes and things like that. So it'd be really fun to come back on and talk through some of the interaction between the game mechanics and then the narratives that they're trying to tell.
Sure. And in fact, I think just to throw you a curveball, and this is not something that you and I have on paper traditionally a lot of experience with, but group or multiplayer experiences we should talk about.
Yeah,
especially like, because I would love to talk about Silent Hill a little bit. And then also the stories that exist around esports.
Yeah.
Right. And then I think that's a great way for us to segue into your game. Right?
Yeah, sounds good.
Which would be fun.
Yeah.
After GDC.
We'll sounds good. Up. I'll see you for coffee at GDC.
Yeah. Brain Arcade is a Princess Hermit production, produced by Kyrene Kim, music and mixing by Jonathan Ontiveros. The podcast is hosted by me, Chris Cross. You can find me and my other endeavors at coffeeacross.com.